This is Last Wild Places, a Patagon Journal podcast where adventurers, conservationists, and other inspiring guests share their stories about nature's last frontiers.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Last Wild Places. This is Jimmy Langman, the executive editor of Patagon Journal. Today, we'll be speaking with Brady Robinson, who is a major figure in the outdoors community of the United States over the past 2 decades. He's originally from Minnesota and an accomplished climber. He has participated in expeditions and first ascents in the mountains of Patagonia, Pakistan, and elsewhere. He worked for 11 years as the executive director of the Access Fund, a nonprofit rock climbing advocacy group that works to keep climbing areas open in the United States. He's also a longtime conservationist. While at the Access Fund, he helped found the Outdoor Alliance, a powerful coalition of outdoor organizations for protecting public lands. And he was a former executive director of the Conservation Alliance, which mobilizes the resources of American businesses to support organizations that defend and restore wildlands. He also has a long connection to Chile and Patagonia. In 2001, he set up an outward bound program here. He has worked for a time with Tompkins Conservation in the region, coordinating their international fundraising and strategic planning. And for the past 2 years, he has been the director of philanthropy at the Freya Foundation, which among their international projects funds and partners with rerouting Argentina to build infrastructure and education programs at Patagonia Park. And last year, the foundation purchased a key 309-hectare property in the Cochamó Valley to help protect this highly valued nature area in Chilean Patagonia. Today, in our conversation with Brady, we will be speaking with him about his career in the outdoor community, as well as about Cochamó and an historic, ambitious effort his foundation launched last month, together with the Nature Conservancy, the Weiss Foundation, Patagonia Inc., and local Chilean environmental group Pueblo Patagonia, in which they are trying to raise $63 million to buy and protect a massive 133,000-hectare wilderness area in Cochamó called Puchagin. Each episode of Last Wild Places, we also talk to the writers of each edition of Patagon Journal to get a deeper perspective on their stories. In today's backstory, Lily Alford talks with Colombian photojournalist David Cosio about his article, Malinka, the Most Beloved, from issue 28. Finally, I want to give a special thanks to Lily for all her help in starting this podcast during her recent internship with Patagon Journal. We wish her the best of luck as she heads back to England and the University of Cambridge to finish up her degree this year. Enjoy the episode. Hello, Brady Robinson. This is Jimmy. Welcome to Last Wild Places podcast. We're very honored to have you with us.
Thanks, Jimmy. I'm really happy to be here and to be a guest on your podcast.
I was reading over your background. You've done quite a lot with your career. How did you get involved with conservation issues and the outdoors?
Well, I have to say that my career was not at all premeditated. I grew up in rural Minnesota between some stands of trees and soybean and cornfields. And I was fortunate enough as a young boy to my parents took us camping. We went on camping trips, a longer camping trip every summer and various outdoor adventures throughout the year. And I did grow up on a stand of trees. So I spent a lot of time outside. And I grew up, but for some reason, I was always really drawn to trees, and I climbed trees a lot. And there was one day when a friend of mine and I were watching, I don't know, The Wild World of Sports or something. Anyway, there was this video of these two crazy German guys who were wearing tights, which was the norm for climbers back in that day, and doing pull-ups hanging by their pinkies. And we were just like, what is this? Who are these people? What are they doing? Again, rural Minnesota, this was totally mind-blowing to us. We'd never seen anything like this. So we went to our local REI store, bought a bunch of climbing gear, bought some how-to books, and literally taught ourselves how to climb out of books on some of the smaller cliffs in Minnesota. And this is before this. This was in the mid 80s, mid 1980s, and so this is before climbing gyms were a thing. And we survived the process of learning that way. We made a lot of mistakes, but none of them were fatal. And so that was kind of the beginning of climbing. And I just always had this innate passion for climbing. I went to college at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and started studying philosophy because I was interested in kind of life's big questions and frankly didn't know what else to do with myself. And on my first summer, I had no idea what to do. And in the back of a climbing magazine, there were ads for a camp in Pennsylvania that was looking for climbing instructors. And so I applied, and I later found out the only reason they hired me is because I had checked a box on model rocketry. They thought maybe I was going to be a model rocketry instructor. But I showed up with almost no experience. I got an entry-level job helping with the climbing wall there. And there was a guy who was part of the program who became a mentor and took me climbing in the Gunks and the Adirondacks. And that was my first real exposure to climbing. And then I just got the bug. I got the bug real bad. And so I studied philosophy. I took a Knowles course. I did the spring semester in the Rockies in 1993. And that really opened my eyes to a new way of living, a new way of being an instructor, the possibility of outdoor education as a career. And I ended up working for North Carolina Outward Bound right out of college and continued with that job on and off for 13 years after I graduated. And there was a moment at North Carolina Outward Bound when one of the administrators there decided that he wanted to start a program in Patagonia. And so I raised my hand for that. I had just rudimentary Spanish, but was part of a reconnaissance mission around the Pucón, Villarica area. And then we ended up running the first course. I was an instructor on the first course in the millennial change in 1999. And I ended up over several seasons, ended up running a growing program there. And it was kind of during that time that I fell in love with Patagonia generally and the Cochamó Valley specifically.
Interesting. Outward Bound, that's one of the first outdoor education schools in the United States. Isn't that right?
Yeah. It's an outdoor education school. It was founded in the United States in the 1960s. And so I started off as an instructor and then helped with their rock climbing. And it was one of the early outdoor education programs in the United States and helped to inspire the development of Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School. And it continues to have a international presence. I think in some ways they've created an environment and a market in which they're no longer the biggest or major player. And so it's, outdoor education has changed a lot, even since I was there in the early 2000s. But I was there, and then I ended up running the Patagonia program for North Carolina Outward Bound for a while. And then I got an office job, was the program director for the whole school. So program quality, efficiency, and safety was under my purview. And I was barely qualified for that. I'd say if there's any constant kind of theme in my career, it's being kind of barely qualified for a lot of these jobs I've gotten, and just kind of hanging on by the skin of my teeth and fake it till you make it a little bit. But anyway, so I did that for 4.5 years, and the time Outward Bound was, I had to, we had shrinking enrollment numbers, and it was challenging. It was, being responsible for the safety of people outside, and then in an environment where demand for your offerings is going down was tricky. And, a mentor of mine pointed out that, in life and in jobs, you're always going to have problems. And if you're privileged and lucky enough, sometimes you get to choose which kind of problems you want to tackle, or, opportunities, if you will. And so I was really hungry for a new set of challenges and opportunities. And I applied to be the executive director of the Access Fund as a passionate climber. I thought it was, maybe I was ready in my career. I was in my mid-30s at that time to be an executive director. So I applied and I didn't hear anything for 3 weeks. And so I subsequently learned that I did make the first cut. Like my resume was literally in the trash bin. And so I wrote an email to the chairman of the board and said, hey, I've taken your subsequent lack of communication as an indication that perhaps I'm not in the running anymore. If I were you, this is what I'd be concerned about as me as a candidate. And here are the kind of mitigating factors. And I said, I just ask an hour of your time, name a time and a place. I'll pay for all my travel expenses. I'd love to meet you and tell you a little bit about myself as a candidate. And it worked. I think sometimes these jobs, it's fate, it's luck. It's a combination of things. I think someone that they had their heart set on had dropped out, and lo and behold, I was living in Asheville, North Carolina at the time. I flew to Boulder and applied, and I got the job. And so then I ran the Access Fund. That's the national organization that keeps climbing areas open and conserved in the United States. I did that for about 11 years, learned a whole lot about conservation and advocacy and running organizations. During that period of time, I became an advisor to the Freya Foundation, which is the organization I work for now. One of the principals at the Freya Foundation was a donor of the Access Fund. And so I got to know the family that is behind the Freya Foundation. So the president of our foundation, her name is Anne, and she has a brother named Carl, who is a passionate climber. And so I got to know them, and they came to trust me. We talked a lot about what, not just their donation to the Access Fund, but what they wanted to accomplish with their foundation. And they said, we want to get involved in land conservation in South America. Basically, what do you think we should do? And I said, I have no idea, but I know who does. And at that time, I was friends with a guy by the name of Paul Baumann, who was running international fundraising for Tompkins Conservation. And through our friendship, we were able to put together a trip to Chile. And again, I had become obsessed with the Cochamó Valley back in my Outward Bound days, which at that point was, 15 years prior, maybe, or something like that. But I knew I'd been keeping in touch with the locals. I knew that there was a particularly important piece of property for sale. And so my advice to Anne at that time was, listen, we could spend a few days in a conference room with a whiteboard talking about, our true north, which is important, not to dismiss strategic planning. But I said, or we could go someplace, meet Chris and hear her insights, and then go look at a potential project and just see how it feels, like look it in the eyes, if you will, and see how it feels. And so that's what we did. We flew down to Chile. Chris Tompkins, I don't know if I had met her, but she didn't know who Carl and Ann were at all. And we spent 2 days with her. And at that point, Doug Tompkins, I presume most people who are listening have heard this story. If not, go watch Wildlife and come back, right? The movie. But Doug had fairly recently passed away, and the grief was just beneath the surface for Chris. I get a little emotional just thinking about it. It was a very raw moment in her life, because she had lost her life partner, and they were on the cusp of handing these parks over. So she was dealing with grief and this massive responsibility of handing over what by any account was the largest private land conservation deal in the history of the world, as far as I know. And so it was an incredible time. And for her to take 2 days out of her life was really something spectacular. So we spent 2 days with her in the house that they had at that time outside of El Amarillo. And we learned that her philosophy was, when doing land conservation, she said there's 4 considerations that she and Doug kept in mind. One was making sure that the political conditions in whatever country they were working on were stable enough, and their private property rights were fairly strong. So that was number 1. And then the other 3 were really easy to remember: big, wild, and cheap. She's like, we buy and protect things that are big, that are wild, i.e. there's not a whole lot of people in them, there's not a whole lot of impacts yet, and they're cheap. And that was the name of the game in the 90s. Big, wild, and cheap worked. Mm-hmm. As things have gotten more peopled and more expensive, and unfortunately less wild, that game doesn't work as well. all the time. But anyway, we learned a lot of wisdom from her, and I'll be forever grateful for that. And then we went into the Cochamó Valley and looked at this property, and Carl and I ended up climbing one of the routes there, El Centro y Adentro. And it was a great trip. And ultimately, Freya Foundation decided not to acquire that property, but ended up making some commitments to Chris and made a really big multi-year commitment on Patagonia Park, Argentina. So during this time, I transitioned out of Access Fund. I'd been there for 11 years, and I felt like I was getting kind of typecast as the climbing guy. And I'd been working on Bears Ears, and I got to meet Chris Tompkins, and I was like, climbing is amazing. And to be clear, climbing is a great entree into conservation. In fact, some of the greatest conservationists from the United States started off as climbers: Yvon Chouinard, John Muir, David Brower, any number of others. And so there's something to it. There's something to climbing and the intense kind of relationship that climbers make with the landscape. But anyway, I felt this calling. And so I ended up working for Chris Tompkins as a head of fundraising for about a year and a half. And incredible experience to work with her. I got to meet, a who's who list of international conservationists and conservation donors. And at that time, Chris was doing something which I didn't totally understand, but the wisdom of it has become much more clear over time. I thought I was coming to help the U.S. team raise money. And I had this, I'd been building an organization and brand at Access Fund for 11 years. That's what I did intuitively: build, grow, market position, donor base, blah, blah, blah. So I came in with that mentality. And Chris's vision, which was, I think, again, was becoming clear, the transition of these parks was happening. She still had grief from Doug. But her vision was that the Chilean program and the Argentinian program needed to be strong, independent, and go forward without her and Doug's name, to have an identity separate. And at that time, I thought the Tompkins name was gold, right? And so sometimes it was hard for me to fully understand the strategy within. But now you've got Rewilding Chile, Rewilding Argentina. They're strong, they're independent, they don't need gringos like myself who live in the States to raise money for them. That was the right call. That was absolutely the right call. And so I was a part of that on the inside. Then I went and ran an organization called the Conservation Alliance, which is basically a membership organization for businesses to pool resources and influence to protect wild places. And the grants only happen in the United States. And so I did that for 2 years. And COVID happened. I won't go into all the personal details, but let's just say a number of us, probably all of us, had some major kind of career and life disruptions during COVID. And I left my job. My marriage didn't survive it. At middle age, I decided to take up a new extreme sport, paragliding, which went great for 6 months. And then I crashed and broke my pelvis and nearly died. The universe literally could not have given me much more of a smackdown. I mean, thank goodness my 2 daughters are fine. But anyway, there was a few kind of hard things that happened all at once to me. And I had a moment I had a lot of moments actually, to just lay in bed with this broken pelvis and a broken heart and think about what I wanted to do with my life. And conservation was still there. And frankly, Cochamó was just under my skin. So the opportunity to work full time for Freya Foundation came up, and Ann and I talked for a while, and she hired me as the director of philanthropy. And so the same foundation that I've been advising since 2017 as a volunteer became a full-time job almost exactly 2 years ago. So hopefully that wasn't too long, but there's the arc of my career.
Great. I'm glad you did that. That was good to get a good overview of your background. I was just about to say that for anyone who reads Patagon Journal, in the current issue of the magazine, you wrote an article about Cochamó and how you basically fell in love with the place. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit how you came to know Cochamó and your first impressions of Cochamó?
Yeah. So we were running, we're going back to 2000-ish, around that time period. And so we were running courses in the earlier let's see. Yeah, we were running courses between. We'd start in Chile, and we'd hike the students in through a valley we knew as the Rio Blanco, but there's a lot of Rio Blanco valleys. Basically, it's parallel and north of, more or less parallel north of Cochamó Valley, and we'd hike them in through there, and then we'd cross the border into Argentina, right on the flanks of Cerro Tronador, the three-peaked, somewhat famous peak that just sits right between the borders there. And then we would actually descend into a beautiful place called Pampalinda and then bus the kids back. Logistically, it was a pain in the butt, but it was incredible. And so I was, we were learning as we had a handful of courses every year. And so part of the job back then was reconnaissance and trying to figure out how to make these courses the best they could be. And so my romantic partner at the time and I had a few days off, and we went into the Cochamó Valley, and I think I'd been in there once before, and I knew there was this place that was the so-called Yosemite Valley of Chile. I understand that as a very U.S. centric expression. Maybe Yosemite is the Cochamó Valley of the United States. I will acknowledge that. And so hopefully the listeners will forgive my U.S. expressions. We've been using that phrase a lot in our campaign currently to protect the area, which we can get into a little bit later. But anyway, so I knew this, and I was like, the students need to experience this. Maybe we can take them into the Cochamó Valley and bring them out. So my partner and I, we went into Cochamó, and we had a map, and we asked for some advice, and we got advice from a Chilean who I learned later didn't know how to read a map, bless his heart. And he said there was a trail that I would just go up, and then you go up the Junta Valley, the Junta River, and there's a trail that goes all the way to the top. And you can cross into the Rio Blanco. And I was like, well, great, this is great. And so we rented some horses, and we took horses in, and we went somewhere near where the anybody who knows Cochamó Valley, there's the toboganas, the slides, basically somewhere in the water slides. We started taking the horses up the Junta Valley, and then our guide, we had one. I think we had a pack horse. One of the horses slipped and rolled over.
Wow.
That's probably not the right. I'm obviously not a professional horseman, but we had a rollover, which was like really kind of alarming. And so we just stopped right there. My partner and I had our backpacks on, and we started hiking up the Junta Valley. And it was kind of in the afternoon, and we hiked, and the trail ran out real quick, and we tried to bushwhack, and it became clear there was no way we were going to bushwhack. And so we started walking up the Junta River, and we found a little clearing, and we went to bed that first night. And I was a younger person back then, and my partner was really excited too, and we were just like, let's go for it. Obviously there's no trail, but let's go for it. So we wake up the next morning, and we just started hiking up the river. And it's amazing once you kind of commit to having wet feet. You keep trying to keep your feet dry when you're traveling in the backcountry. Everybody's kind of like, you're kind of tiptoeing around, and then when you just decide, I'm just going to march through the river, boom, our progress went pretty fast. And so we marched up and up and up, and there was a few waterfalls where we would have to actually bushwhack around. And towards the late afternoon, we got to this. If you look on the map, there's this kind of the cirque, and we got to this cirque with the headwaters of the Junta River, and it was absolutely pristine. And there was a stand of alerce trees. I didn't know it at the time, but the whole region had been full of alerce trees, and they're so valuable for so many different human, commercial, and personal purposes that basically any alerce tree that anybody could get to was long gone by the time we were hiking there. And we got to a stand of alerce trees. These trees that grow thousands of years old, and there was not a sign of human passage at all. We got to a place where if you were going to camp within miles, it was absolutely the obvious place to camp. Nothing. No, not a single piece of trash, no evidence of a fire ring, anything, not a blaze or a mark on a tree, nada. And it just completely blew my mind that we had happened upon a place so beautiful. And a few things, as I mentioned in the article, just kind of hit me. Number one is we have no business bringing students here. And I'm all for hard experiences, but it was serious to get up there. If anything had ever happened to one of our students, there's no way we're going to get them out without a helicopter. And furthermore, it was just so pristine. I don't care how good your leave no trace practices are. If you've got two instructors and around 10 students hiking through an area, it looks like a really big pack of animals came through. It's inevitable, really, if you're traveling off trail anyway. And so that was the first thing. It was like, this is not a course area, number one, at least this passage. And number two, this should be protected. Oh my God. And so we kept going on. We went over this little pass, and then we descended into the next river valley. And the canyon, which looks kind of like bamboo to the untrained eye, it was so steep, we would go down the slope with our backs pointing downhill and take the canyon under our armpits and kind of use it as like a rappel device almost. And then we got to this point where we were looking through the trees. It was kind of dense. And suddenly we weren't looking at tree trunks. We were looking at treetops, like 10 feet in front of us. And we realized that was the only way we could tell that we were on this top of a cliff band. So we were able to navigate that. But the whole thing suddenly started feeling fairly serious. And we'd committed to this descent. And, going down a slope of canyon is way easier than going up. So we kind of felt like we were committed. Eventually we got all the way down. We got to the river at the bottom. And it was kind of class 2-ish rapids, maybe more. I mean, it wasn't a whole lot of water, but it definitely felt serious to be hiking in and along the river. And we started hiking, and then darkness came, and my partner made it abundantly clear that this was not okay. So we stopped. It's like river hiking in the dark, not okay. So we bivvied. We didn't have a whole lot of food. We'd run out of food. Because again, we expected this to be an easy passage. And then we got up, we bivvied out. We got up the next morning, hiked out, ran into two Chileans who were, they were cooking probably mutton. They were cooking something for lunch. And my Spanish was terrible at the time. And I was trying, and we popped out, and they just kind of accepted that we were there. But when we tried to explain where we had come from, they absolutely didn't believe us. They just thought we were nuts, that no one could have come from where we did. But they fed us, and I had paces on me, and we rented a few horses, and they got us out. We got to the trailhead, and we'd overstayed what I had anticipated by a day, and I barely got back to the program in time to resume my duties as program director. But to this day, that was one of the greatest. I've done a lot of climbing and expeditions and some great mountain ranges, but that experience was one of the most iconic and influential in my life. And some of the guys who run Pueblo Patagonia, I've shared this story with them, and they say it's always the same with this place, that you fall, the Cochamó Valley, that is, you fall in love with it, and then it's almost like you don't have a choice. You have to do what you can to protect it, and that certainly was the case for me.
Yeah, I first went there in February of 1996, and there was hardly anybody there. Nowadays, you go during the summer. If you go during February now, it's packed with people. It's so beautiful. Climbers love this place. Hikers love this place. When you were with the Access Fund, how did you deal with um, protecting places while at the same time creating access for enjoying these places? How do you balance the two? A place like Cochamó has got so many great places for climbers and trekkers, but there's a danger that it can be loved to death.
Of course. Yeah, that was always a tension, Jimmy. And I think the some of the bigger conservation entities, I think some of their thinking has changed over that. That was something I saw from the time that I was at Access Fund was, when I started in the kind of mid 2000s, the bigger like the Wilderness Society, Nature Conservancy, and some of the other really big players didn't really pay us a whole lot of attention. And over time, I think the conservation groups saw that, one, recreational advocates could be really good allies and could actually be trusted, and two, that was the shifting demographics. I mean, there was a moment, I don't know, roughly 10 years ago now, I think, that Nature Conservancy notably did some demographic research, and like the average age of their member was like late 60s or something. I'm probably getting that off, but the general thing was true, which is that their membership base was old. And that can be great for fundraising for a period of time, but if there aren't new people coming in, obviously your organization isn't going to be sustainable. So I think even people who have sometimes seen recreation more as part of the problem have seen that with changing demographics and the need to garner public support, that recreation, in their view, might be a necessary evil. Of course, in my view, it's the reason I'm part of the conservation movement. And I think, as people say, it's hard to love a place that you don't know.
Right.
And so, but it's always a balance, and there will always be differences of opinion. And at Access Fund, I used to tell people, I don't believe that climbing is the most important thing in the world. However, at that time, it was my job to advocate for the climbers. And so I said I was going to do that with integrity, and we'll be part of planning processes. And, again, what was really formative for me in Bears Ears National Monument, which was a big battle here in the United States and continues to this day, frankly, but was working with tribes and the bigger conservation NGOs, and also, and being a conservation and advocacy group. And so we worked actively on the designation. We worked hard to get climbing mentioned in President Obama's original proclamation, which happened. And it was just 2 words, rock climbing, but that's like over a year of my life of advocacy. Yeah. And then subsequently, when Secretary Zinke and President Trump reduced the size, we were part of a number of, we were one of the lawsuits, and there were a number of them, saying that, you can't do that. That's not, you're not allowed to do that, which is a debate which we won't get into today. But anyway, so those are all instructive and informative. And so I think that's sort of where I learned the power of recreation and all, or any activity that connects people to the land, and how to leverage that for conservation. And yes, you're right that, when you were there and when I was there in the early 2000s, the Cochamó Valley was a very different place. When, I was there after you were, but there were just a handful of gauchos, 1 or 2 little cabins. And, if the climbers were there, they were holed up someplace and they weren't visible. And now, over 15,000 people come in and out of the valley, most of them on foot, during the high season, 15,000. And there'd be more if the local Chileans hadn't self-organized with the Organización Valle Cochamó and weren't working to regulate that. It would be more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what Patagon Journal is about too, bringing together the outdoor community with conservationists, also the travel sector. I think there's a strong alliance that can be built between these different interests. I was looking at your TED Talk, which you did 11 years ago, where you said human-powered recreation can help secure the future of the conservation movement. And I think I definitely agree with that. I think people who love outdoor recreation are some of the strongest allies conservationists have.
That's right. And I would say that the transition can be difficult sometimes for outdoor recreationalists. And I would say this is true in probably Cochamó Valley, and it certainly was true in the United States. What counts as a sustainable activity when there's only a handful of people doing it, or maybe a few hundred people doing it, is very different than what counts as a sustainable activity when there's thousands or tens of thousands of people doing it. And if you were there in the early days, wherever we're talking about, a small climbing area in the United States or Cochamó Valley or anything else, and you used to just kind of showing up, doing what you want, living, free and camping where you want and making your own trails or, any number of things. And then regulations come in because of increased use and visitation and just, more active management. Sometimes the people who went in the early days have a really hard time making that shift. A lot of people understand the need for it. And yet it's hard not to pine for the old days when you can go to Cochamó Valley, be there by yourself, not know that there wasn't a trail up the valley, or, every climbing wall had 1 or 0 routes on it. And so, the adage is true, change is hard. But I think we can all, take a step back and understand that when places become more popular and when visitation goes up, management has to happen. And right now, to enter the Cochamó Valley during the high season, they limit, again, this is Organización Valle Cochamó, the self-organized entity. They limit the number of day users.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to show that you've got a reserved campsite to come into the valley.
Yeah.
And there's an orientation. You have to take all your trash out. And this small, little, relatively underfunded group is effectively managing the visitation and use of this valley, much more so than if it were just a free-for-all. It's an incredible example of a number of local businesses and individuals self-organizing to not just to protect a place, but to manage it.
My first job was working for David Brower, who was very active in Yosemite National Park. His first job before he was at the Sierra Club was at Yosemite. And he used to say that it was good that all the tourists went to the valley because the rest of the park, 95% of the tourists would go to the valley, and the rest of the park was relatively scarce of tourists and campers. Potentially, if you succeed in buying Puchagin, maybe something similar can happen in this area, where you can concentrate the tourists in certain areas, and the rest of the park will stay as wild as possible.
If that's the case, Jimmy, would it be helpful for me to frame, Puchagin and kind of what we're talking about? So, there's a really big piece of property, 131,000 hectares, or 328,000 acres, if you think in terms of acres, or I think it's about 2 New York cities, if you think in terms of New York cities. There's all these different units, but and it's been for sale by a man by the name of Roberto Hagiman for a number of years. It was listed on Christie's on and off for $150 million and advertised as this incredible pristine hacienda. And how big it is really kind of boggles the mind. And the property extends all the way down to the south, the Rio Puelo, and encompasses the Rio Manso River Valley and any number of smaller tributaries and mountains and lakes. And it goes all the way up to the north to the edge of Cochamó Valley and encompasses the majority of the rock climbing. And so this property boundary comes down to the foot of the mountains. And the Cochamó Valley itself is really a mosaic of private land ownership. And as more and more people got to know this place, people, as they do, wanted a piece of paradise. And so people started buying lots and subdividing them. And again, we visited, the Freya Foundation visited in 2017 and looked at a place called Campo Aventura. And we stayed in touch with the locals. And when I started this job about 2 years ago, I was talking to a guy by the name of Rodrigo Condesa. And he said, Brady, there's a piece of property that was threatened to be divided into 79 lots. And it was a so-called conservation development. There was a company that had bought the property, and using the new conservation easement law, at that time relatively new, still relatively new conservation easement law in Chile called Derecho Real de Conservación, they were going to sell these 79 lots, and there would be a small developable portion, and the rest of it would be conserved, air quote, conserved, if you will, with a Derecho Real de Conservación. And there are a number of people who believe that there are for-profit entities that are being, opportunistic at best in using this particular new conservation law in Chile. And a lot of the locals didn't believe that 79 lots was conservation in any way, shape, or form. So there was a huge uproar, and this is before we were involved. There was a huge uproar, and basically stopped the developer in his tracks. And so there was a standstill. There's this piece of property, and it had been, slated to be subdivided. And so we came in, and with Pueblo Patagonia's help, we bought it. And so now it doesn't really have, as you hike in the valley, you won't really know when you're on the property. We call it the Freya property, but it's about 309 hectares, and it encompasses 8 kilometers of the approach trail. And so it was a strategic property, not only because of the threat of subdivision, which again, the locals did a pretty good job of stopping, but it also is the place you would build a road if you're going to build a road. And at that time, Roberto Hagiman's intentions weren't entirely clear. Again, the owner of the Hacienda Puchiguin. So, and he had tried to build a huge hydroelectric dam in the Rio Manso, and there's a road that goes part of the way up there, and Pueblo Patagonia thwarted his efforts there. He had anticipated building a big real estate development in the Cochamó Valley. He had some beautiful mock-ups and art, and there was a concern that he would maybe want to build a road from Cochamó all the way through the valley, and potentially even up Paso León, the historic pass from Argentina, which was over 100 years ago, was used to run cattle through the Cochamó Valley and into the Raillencavi estuary, as far as I understand, to go to market. So anyway, this whole historic place was under threat. And so Pueblo Patagonia, an incredible grassroots organization that's been around for over 10 years, has been effectively thwarting a lot of these development efforts. And by buying that property, we effectively took those 309 hectares out of circulation, if you will. Right around that same time, a representative of the Weiss Foundation was with us, and we flew over the entire Hacienda Puchiguin. And it's really impossible, at least for me, it was impossible to fully appreciate how big this property is until you fly over it. I've flown over it about 3 times now, and one of the times I flew over it was with some people from Pueblo Patagonia. It just became a joke. We'd point to a mountain that didn't look like it had ever been climbed and say, "What's that?" Puchiguin. "What's that lake?" Puchiguin. "What's that glacier?" Puchiguin. "What's that over there?" Puchiguin. I mean, it's insane how big this is. And this was a piece of property that Doug and Chris looked at many years ago. And at the time, the titles were a disaster. Basically, there wasn't clean title to the property. And one of the ironies of this whole project in some ways is that Roberto Hagiman, the owner, who has tried to do a number of different for-profit development activities that would have been quite destructive, is the one who cleaned the titles up. And about a year, I don't know, in June of, what was it, 2023, that he finally got clean title of the whole property. And so again, that was one of the things that kept Doug and Chris away. And so anyway, so after flying over it, we came back and we had the Freya Foundation and Weiss, we had a conversation with Pueblo Patagonia, and we provided some seed funding for a study and we basically said, "Hey guys, we agree with you. There's this huge opportunity here. do a map, do a study. Who are the owners? Where are the property boundaries? What's this thing going to look like? And initially, we had recommended that they just look at Cochamó Valley because the entirety of Puchiguin just seemed too big and massive. And Rodrigo sent me a voice memo, and he said, Brady, we're sorry, but this is an opportunity of a lifetime. We're not going small. We're going big. We're going to present you with a plan for this whole thing. And again, this is like a small organization that had been effectively doing direct action, keeping Roberto Hagiman from doing destructive actions. But that is a very different thing than putting together a proactive long-term vision for the conservation of a massive area. And so they did that. They came back and they were incredibly professional. The proposal was thorough and included a lot of engagement with local communities. This was not some monolithic, unilateral move. This was like, okay, these are all the pieces. And so it was incredibly compelling vision that they articulated. And so, we were in, Freya was in, Weiss Foundation was in, notably the Nature Conservancy was in and passionate, and now Patagonia Inc., the clothing company, and their funding wing, Holdfast, is in. And so we've got this incredible coalition of entities working to protect this area. And a few months ago, we entered into a purchase agreement. So it was Pueblo Patagonia were the ones who were working directly with Roberto Hagiman and came to terms on a price to buy the whole thing. Roberto Hagiman has an 80% interest, but to buy the whole thing from Roberto and his partner. And we signed a purchase option and put $1 million down as earnest money in February of this year. And the entire project is our current budget is $78 million, and that includes purchasing the property, doing some infrastructure projects and training and economic development, and a modest endowment, and basically a plan which isn't completely clear yet. There's a lot of things that need to be determined in conjunction with the local community, but a 7-year plan to conserve and effectively manage the entire area. And coalition work can be tricky. It's a great way to do things, but when you've got a flat coalition entity, as we do with our steering committee, it's not always clear who's in charge, and you have to get a lot of consensus. And so we were still doing that kind of consensus building behind the scenes. And lo and behold, our project landed on the front cover of the New York Times on May 1st. And it was just like, whoa, so we were like almost ready for that, but not quite. And so, boy, I tell you what, our website and our fundraising portal and everything spun up real quick after that happened. And so it was perfect, though. Sometimes you need a deadline and a shot in the arm to get things rolling. So that was a huge boon for our project. And it went from being, not that well known to being internationally known really quickly. And I'll just say a few more things. I'm sure you've got some questions, but there's about 65 families that live in and around the project area. And one of the things that Pueblo Patagonia has done an exceptionally good job at is going out and visiting with everyone and asking them, what do you think about a conservation project here? What are your hopes and dreams and vision for the future? Do you have title to your property? In some cases, the answer to that is no. The title problems weren't just with Roberto. Some people have been living on properties for potentially generations and don't have clean title to their own properties. And so Pueblo Patagonia is the on the ground organization run by people who live in the area, have done an exceptional job. And they really kept everything. There was pressure from, we're a fairly small foundation, maybe medium-sized, you could say, but there was pressure from all of us, like, hey, we need to talk about this publicly so we can start raising the money. And they did a great job of saying, no, we're going to go slow, and we need 100%, buy-in and consensus, if you will, from the local groups. Because you can imagine, if you've been living here for generations, the worst thing that could possibly happen is learning about some big conservation initiative driven in part by foreign NGOs, and learning about it by reading it in the paper. That would feel terrible. Anyone would feel distrust and frustration in such a situation. And so I'm really proud of Pueblo Patagonia's leadership in general, and specifically how much they have engaged with the local community, and how much they and the local community have been and will continue to be empowered to make decisions on self-determination, how the area will be protected, managed, and ultimately, we hope, become a really strong economic driver for those families, for the Cochamó city, and also for the surrounding region.
Yeah, Pueblo Patagonia is doing incredible work. They've been around for several years. And Rodrigo Candes, as you mentioned, he's been around even longer than Pueblo Patagonia. He started a Conserva Cochamó, which is it's another NGO that predated Pueblo Patagonia that was involved in Cochamó. So they've definitely built up the ties that you mentioned with the local communities, and I think that's going to be something that will be important for the long run, making sure that this thing goes smoothly. You mentioned that New York Times article. Has that gotten some big donations already, or you have anything exciting to?
It hasn't. It hasn't. We're still in an active. We just went public, relatively recently. So I think it's okay for me to say. So the goal is 78, and we were at 20 and a little bit in terms of committed funds. I'll say, raising money and building trust with foundations and individuals who have the capacity to contribute to this, it takes time. But I think that New York Times article was worth a lot to our coalition. And there were at least a handful of foundations I can think of that became a lot more excited about the project when they read about it in the New York Times. So again, the individual entities involved in this, many of us have been around for a long time. This project and this coalition is relatively new in the eyes of a lot of the funders, potential funders at least. And so as we're recording this in the middle of May, there are a few members of Pueblo Patagonia who are touring the United States right now, visiting with, again, individuals, foundations, and corporations that might be interested in contributing to this project. And, in the professional fundraising world, we call that cultivation. And basically, you have to build trust. If there are people who are interested, you have to share a vision that's compelling, that they want to buy into, potentially contribute to with, financial resources or maybe other ways, and build relationships and trust with these people and entities. And that takes time. We do have a time crunch. There's the option agreement anticipates various scenarios. So under certain scenarios, we would have until June of 2027 to raise all the funds, but there's a few deadlines. We don't need to get into it here, but it's a fairly, I guess, not complicated, but there's a few different tiers. And the best case scenario, it basically is that we raise the entire purchase price, which is $63 million, by June of next year. So just a little over a year. And, but if we don't, we could do it. There's a few different, like I said, scenarios. But my hope is that at the very least in the next 2 years, we're able to raise not just the purchase price, but the entire project price of $78 million. And we'll see. The place is so charismatic. I really do believe that if, donors large and small, potential donors large and small, actually see this place with their own eyes and spend time there, they won't be able to help but to support it. When I was working for Chris Tompkins and Tompkins Conservation, our internal, one of the stories we told is that we had 100% conversion on donors who saw the parks that Doug and Chris created with their own eyes. And in my experience, that was true. If someone was maybe interested in donating, we just had to somehow convince them to go down, see the park, see the animals. In that case, see the incredible rewilding efforts that rewilding Chile and Argentina are doing, and we had 100% conversion rate. And in terms of the Cochamó, I really believe that place, those granite peaks and those mountains, and then certainly if you're fortunate enough to fly over it or hike in different parts of it, speak for themselves. And I think David Brower's observation about Yosemite and about, if I heard you correctly, Jimmy, the impacts being really concentrated in the valley and the vast park being largely unpopulated, that will certainly be true with the Hacienda Puchiguin as well. The vast majority right now of impact and visitation happens from going up the Cochamó River up until La Junta. And there's a little place called Rock Island, which is this kind of, it's not quite pebbles. I guess they're like, apple to grapefruit sized rocks that create this beach-like structure in the river. And that's really popular. And then after that, the visitation really falls off. In February, I hiked a route that's known as the Horseshoe locally, and my daughter and I, 17, started in the Rio Manso, and we hiked up and around the Horseshoe over the course of 7 days, and got to see the road that Roberto Hagiman had built in anticipation of his hydroelectric dam, and got to see where it ended because Pueblo Patagonia stymied his efforts. And we saw almost nobody. We saw locals, one or two locals, and we saw maybe on an average of 2 other trekkers as we hiked in and around. And there were a few more people as we kind of got closer to La Junta, but all of a sudden, as we passed Rock Island, again, we'd been hiking for 5 days maybe at that point, seeing almost nobody. We got past this point called Rock Island on our way to La Junta, and suddenly there were Chilean students in swimsuits and towels asking us if we knew where Rock Island was. It was kind of shocking, and we came into La Junta, and it's the visitation isn't again, it's well managed, but there's a lot of people. We've been alone, and then we came into one of the camping areas, and there's college kids playing soccer, and on the one hand, people might lament that, and people who were there in the early days and were used to having nobody there may lament that. I'm not one of those people. I think it's incredible that before this is just, it's the Cochamó Valley. It isn't protected. It isn't a park. It doesn't have any official designation, but it's become really popular with young people. And I don't know if that's word of mouth, Instagram, but unlike a lot of the parks in Chile that are remote, very difficult, and potentially expensive to access, if you're a young person or a person that doesn't have a whole lot of resources, and you live in Santiago, where of course the majority of people in Chile live, you can take an overnight bus to Puerto Montt, and then you can take a transfer to the trailhead, and you can hike in with ragtag equipment. Some of the people that are hiking in are like holding garbage bags or plastic bags. They obviously they haven't, again, I did Knowles course. I was taught, a certain way to access the backcountry. They weren't doing it that way, but they're doing it. They're going in with their stuff, and sometimes they get, the rains come and they get their butts handed to them.
Yeah.
But there are Chileans actively enjoying and learning to love this place, and it warms my heart because I think that, again, just to return to where we were before, they believe that is their spot. And that means that if our efforts to protect it are successful, there's going to be a whole generation of Chileans who are going to raise their hands and say, yeah, I remember that. When I was 20, I went in there. It was beautiful on the hike in. On the hike out, it rained. I panicked. I got hypothermic, whatever. Everybody's going to have their story. And as they get older and assume, levels of influence and power in their society, that place is going to have more and more defenders. And like it or not, with the number of people there are on this planet, people in the conservation world like to talk about permanent protection. In the United States, we've got the Wilderness Act of 1964, which is one of the highest levels of protection. There's national park status. There's national park status and any number of conservation statuses in Chile. In fact, the law is shifting a bit to be more kind of environmentally friendly there. But if we're honest with ourselves, there really isn't anything. There's no such thing as permanent protection. The one of the greatest forms of permanence is for people to grow up loving and appreciating these places. And when threats come in ways that maybe we can't even anticipate today, knowing that there are going to be a group of people who raise their hands and say, no, this place is special. We need to protect it. It's not going to be turned into whatever the alternative might be. I think that's one of the best forms of permanence that there is.
No, absolutely. I totally agree that these places need to be open to the public, and it's great that Chileans of all incomes are going in there. The only other thing is that I remember before the organization in the Valley of Cochamó was formed, there was a point where there wasn't much control, and there was trash all over the place at times. But now I think they've got it under control. But that's what I was saying earlier. As long as it's, there's some responsibility there with things like trash and how they treat the landscape. It's all good. I think it's great that people are getting outdoors and hiking and so on. Preliminary thoughts about what the long-term vision is if you succeed in buying the Puchiguin. Is it going to be a park? Is it going to be a biosphere reserve? What's the thinking right now?
The final type of protection for Puchiguin is going to result in a management planning and conservation planning process. And so the short answer is right now we're not 100% sure, and we're going to go through a process to determine what levels of protection will the Hacienda Puchiguin will have in different parts. There's, like I said, Chilean environmental and conservation law has been changing a bit, and my understanding is that there's a new possible national park designation that can even apply to private land. Now, I'm not saying we would try to use such a thing, but there are a lot of different options on the table. I think everyone is committed to a few things. We're, I think, to a person and organization, committed to doing the best job we can to protect the entire tract of land. I think we're committed to traditional ways of life by the local community and by people who live and own property within the project area continue unabated. And that, in fact, economic activity and opportunities increase as a function of this project, which means that while there might be more strict protections in certain parts of it, there's going to have to be protections that allow for economic activity and certain kinds of development within at least the areas that are more heavily used. One of the interesting phenomena that's been happening in the Puchiguin region is that families that lived and maybe farmed have been gradually moving out, and oftentimes the generation below doesn't want to live in a rural area and raise sheep or cows or do whatever it takes. And so as you walk the horseshoe, there were some I've got these haunting pictures of buildings where there's still a table with, even the remnants of place settings sitting on the table that are abandoned. And so you get the sense that, life just hit a point where it wasn't tenable, maybe economically or whatever at a certain point. And so in general, families have been moving out, and Roberto Hagiman took advantage of that and bought up some of these properties. So this project entails not just this massive Hacienda Puchiguin, but about 14 other properties as well, some of which were sold by families who no longer had an interest in living there. So our hope is that, in fact, it becomes more viable economically to live there, and that some of these families continue to be there. And so we'll see. There's Pueblo Patagonia has also done a good job of keeping, local, regional, and the national government aware of what we're doing. And this is not, our announcement didn't come as a surprise to the Chilean government. They will be most likely important and maybe even more important partners in the future. But at the moment, this is private property and this is a private transaction.
So you were saying you raised about 20 million of the 78 million goal. So far, is that coming from the steering committee of the Conservative Puchagin Initiative, the Nature Conservancy, Freya Foundation, Patagonia Inc., Weiss Foundation, etc.? Where is the money coming from right now?
The majority of that is from current members of our steering committee of the current alliance. That's right.
So do you think the rest will come from foundations? Where are you trying to get the rest of the money from?
I hope so. I mean, like I said, I think if I think this is going to be enticing. In fact, we've got early indications that this is of interest to certain private foundations. Some private foundations, at least in the United States, operate in various ways. Some have staff, some have very defined funding criteria. Some are largely dependent on the founder or the founder's family to fall in love with the place. And so in the medium term, our hope is that we pique in people's interest enough to come down and visit. And I don't want to be overly confident, but as I said before, we have a good reason to believe that a lot of people who will see this place with their own eyes will find it so important and irresistible, both just sort of emotionally, but from a conservation perspective, that they'll feel the need to contribute. And we also hope and are actively engaged in discussions with some of the most wealthy and influential families in Chile. And we hope that some of those families will agree that this is a place worthy of protection and contribute. But we'll see. These campaigns, the definition of adventure is any activity of consequence with an uncertain outcome. So this is an adventure. I'm confident that we'll be successful. We've got the Nature Conservancy, the world's biggest environmental organization, as part of our coalition. That's not a surefire indicator of success, but it sure does come in handy.
Yeah.
Groups, but there is a lot of money wrapped up in foundations in the world and in the United States in particular. If anyone listening would like to learn more about that, I highly recommend a book called Decolonizing Wealth, which is a first-person account of an indigenous person who's working within the foundation world. And it isn't only about that, but it's a great read and a great frame for thinking about how we can unleash these vast sums that are, to a large part, ensconced in these foundations, and some of which are only paying out 5% a year. So thank goodness for these foundations. They make projects like these possible. But my hope is that a number of them will step forward and make really meaningful contributions. And of course, $78 million sounds like a lot. And it is, by any measure. It's a lot of money. And yet when you think about it, this conservation project twice the size of New York, when it's all said and done, there's the potential for this whole project area to be roughly 71% the size of Yosemite National Park. And anyone who knows, how huge the full park is, far beyond just the valley floor, gets a sense of the kind of scale that we're talking about. And so by that measure, I think this is actually a good buy and is one of the only remaining projects that does meet Doug and Chris's original criteria of big, wild, and relatively cheap.
Well, that's awesome that this is happening. I think this is something that a lot of people have been wanting and have been dreaming about, and it's great that it's incredible that it's happening. So thanks a lot for
Thank you, Jimmy,
for your commitment to this, and wish you a lot of luck. I'm also very optimistic that you're going to achieve that 78 million goal. I think you got the right people involved, that's for sure. So
Thank
I would
you.
be surprised that you don't.
Yeah, well, there's a number of us who are going to literally do everything in our power to make sure this happens. And I do want to say to anyone who's still listening here, no donation is too big or too small. We're going to get, we're going to get to 78 million, hopefully in $1 million increments to a large extent. That being said, Pueblo Patagonia is an organization that ran on a roughly $100,000 budget for many years, and they're lean and they're mean, and operating funds are also of critical importance. And so if people want to know more, they can go to conservapuchagin.org. Again, conservapuchagin.org, and there's English and Spanish language versions of the website. You can donate there. There's a way to get a U.S. tax benefit. Our intention is that it's an easy platform for anyone to donate, regardless of where you are in the world. And for people who have the interest and means of donating over $20,000 US, there's a email address, dona@conservapuchagin.org, and send an email there, and we'll respond and give you some options. Anything over $20,000, putting on your credit card and doing it through the web form may or may not be ideal for you. So we've got any number of ways that people can contribute. And again, thank you for your interest, and for you yourself clearly fell in love with this place, Jimmy, and for inviting us to tell our story in the magazine and on the podcast today. It was my pleasure to do so.
Today we have with us David Cosio, whose article Malinka the Most Beloved was featured in our most recent edition of the Patagon Journal. Thank you for joining me today, David.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So to start us off, can you tell us about Malinka?
About the place itself, well, Malinka, it's not an island itself, it's the name of the town. Actually, the name of the island is called Isla Ascension Island in English, and it's like the entrance to the Patagonic channels in the occidental side of Patagonia. It starts in the Aysén region. It's like the limit with Los Lagos region. It's south from Chiloé. And it's just this really amazing place because you have like, still this crazy geography, like a lot of rocky islands with a lot of nature, because it's like having all the humidity that comes from Antarctica. Actually, the Humboldt current brings this humidity, so you have a lot of rain, so you have too much abundance of life, like outside forests, but then also because of the same current, you have so many nutrients that it's like bringing krill and seaweed to this place. So you have whales, you have sea lions, sometimes even penguins, a lot of mussels, fishes. So it's a really rich place, and yeah, like I just got to know about it when I was there, like to understand how really special that place was. Also, well, Chile is special because of its geography. So you have the Andes Mountains, and in a really short distance, you have then the ocean. So from Malinka, you can also see like huge volcanoes like the Melimoyu and the Corcovado volcano. They are giants from this area. And yeah, it also have a lot of history from the first German, Spanish people, the migrants from Chile that went there to principally mainly because of the wood. You have the Cypress de las Guaytecas. Las Guaytecas is the name of the archipelago. And that tree is just from that area. It's really special because it's really good for building in rainy areas because it's really waterproof and it doesn't get bad with time. So yeah, there's a lot going on in that place.
Yeah, wow. And I suppose I'm right in thinking it's quite a remote destination. So how did you go around organizing the trip? I know it wasn't just you in the group.
Yeah, so it's actually not that hard to go today because I don't know if you knew, like the towns from Patagonia, the coast towns, they're all connected by ferries, like the main towns. So from Quellón in the south of Chile, you have a ferry that goes twice in a week or 3 times per week in to Malinca, and it's a 5-hour navigation trip. And you can also go by plane. It's a 40 minutes flight from Puerto Montt.
Mm.
So now it's kind of easy to go. Like you just need time. Yeah.
Yeah. How much time do you need to do it properly?
Wow. I think if you wanna like maybe dive and make some whale tours or just go to hike in the nature, I would say at least 5 days to be just there. Then you
Yeah.
have 2 days to arrive to Malinca if you go by land from Santiago, or one if you go by plane.
In your article, you write about diving with sea lions. Were there any other creatures which you came into contact to?
The plan was originally to free dive with dolphins, but we went first to the sea lions, colonies, and we dived there, and I got some water on my camera. So at the end, we could navigate with dolphins, but we couldn't dive with them because it was not if I was not going to do the photos.
Yeah.
So yeah, but you have also orca, you have blue whales.
Wow.
It's not so easy to dive with them, and in Chile it's also not legal to dive with whales, just if it happens. But yeah, in that trip exactly, I saw mainly sea lions.
You mentioned in the article as well about some of your interactions with local people.
Yeah.
Was there anyone really special who you spoke to and taught you about Malinka and the island that didn't make it into the article that you couldn't write about?
Oh yes. So it's this girl, woman, Gabby. She knows a lot about the story of Malinka. So they told me in the hostel where I was staying, like, you should go to talk with her. She knows everything, and she's really kind. Like she likes to share the stories from her town, right?
Yeah.
So she was telling us about this kind of colonizers that went to Malinka, like German families, Spanish families, people from Chile, like Chilean people, and they all went looking for new possibilities because they had the mussels. I don't know the name in English, but erizos de mar. They are really abundant there. Like these mussels with spikes that you cut them and they are like really tasty.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
Those
I think
ones.
so.
They dive to fish them, and also because of the wood. So now you can understand like how the town was born, right? And yeah, she have like a lot of pictures from these families, from how the town was in the past, and it's crazy. Like she have this wall with all these historical pictures, so it was really interesting. And there was also this guy. Yeah, there's a lot of cool people there. He was a boat maker, and
Wow.
he's the last boat maker with the traditional technique. I couldn't take so much pictures of him, also because he didn't want it to be too much
Yeah.
online. But there was also the guy who took me to dive called Raúl, Victor
Yeah.
Ruiz. Sorry, Victor Ruiz, and he's really passionate about marine wildlife. I think he's the person who knows the most about the whales and everything. So yeah, he was teaching me a lot about the nature. It was my first time experiencing like the Patagonic coasts. And it's a complete ecosystem, like really different from all the coasts I have seen.
It sounds really special. Have you got, if anyone has even a thought of going to Malinka, what would you say to them?
I would say it depends. If they are divers, I would say you really need to go dive there because it's crazy. You have like I told you, the wildlife, but you also have the rocks and the kelp forest. It's really, really beautiful with so much wildlife. But also maybe to do some whale tours, to see whales, and to support the local community, to eat a lot of local food. Wow, the food is really good there. You can imagine local seafood, typical food from the region like curanto. They also told me they eat baby sea lions. It's not so
Wow.
cool, but it's part of the culture. If I'm not wrong, they call it popote.
Popote.
I saw some pictures, it was crazy, like some baby sea lion roasted,
Oh
and
my
they say,
gosh. Yeah, you didn't go
but
for that
I
one.
didn't get to try that. I think they don't sell it in
No.
restaurants.
So maybe your advice would be definitely go. The diving's amazing, the people are amazing, but you don't need to eat baby sea lion.
No, not baby sea lion, but a lot of mussels and choritos, locos.
Yeah, sounds amazing. Thank you
Yeah,
so much, David.
you're welcome.
Published in print and digital since 2011, Patagon Journal is a bilingual magazine in English and Spanish about Patagonia and the world's last wild places. Head to our website, patagonjournal.com, where you can find our magazine and read our online articles. To subscribe, support our work through our special premium membership program, or buy back issues, merch and more, visit our online store at patagonstore.com. Any suggestions or to contribute stories to the magazine, get in touch with us by email at editors@patagonjournal.com.